I was illuminated by the stock market spotlights as the ground beneath my feet disappeared. I reached for the symbolic bell that started trading, and suddenly the price of my corporation did not appear on the screens behind me. Instead of the charts, a black and white video from my own office appeared, dated last year. I sat at the table and clearly uttered a phrase that I had never said. "We draw numbers, let the world believe." The dry noise of thousands of hearts simultaneously giving the wrong beat hung in the hall. The camera caught a close-up, and I saw a stranger in me. A smooth tie loop, a polished smile. That woman from the front row, the investor whom I had been persuading for 3 years, lowering her gaze as if removing an invisible crown from me and putting it aside at the edge of the stage. I held the gavel as proof of my innocence, and I understood that now it would sound like a verdict, no matter where I hit it. While the technical director is making hoarse excuses into the microphone, saying it's a montage, I already know what's happened. Foreign hands have entered a place where, apart from me, only my father had access, and my father has been gone for a year, so someone brought foreign hands. I feel the operational vacuum sucking the warmth out of me, invisible knives moving in the air, letters from supervisory authorities, warnings from banks, whispers from partners who yesterday swore to believe in me to the end. "This is impossible," I hear my own voice say, although I don't say anything, because the noise around me has already died down, and I stand straight, like in a vanity textbook photograph, until my former lawyer appears from the right side of the stage and, not even trying to hide his triumph, says briefly, in a businesslike manner, the way we both liked, "Mr. H, you should get off the stage." The press is waiting for a comment. "It's a fake," I say finally, and I hear the words fall next to my shoes. "Prove it," he replies, and he pushes the crowd aside like heavy curtains, letting me into the corridor with the cold glass. I walk away, and the screens behind me keep spinning. My voice, my profile, my sigh as the numbers are drawn on the virtual board, and for a second it seems to me that in the room of the frame, somewhere in the reflection, a familiar shadow has passed with a movement that I recognize unmistakably, a barely noticeable nerve on the left cheek, a hereditary habit of my brother, the same one we buried 5 years ago in a narrow cemetery by the sea, where the pine trees are so close to the water that they seem to want to learn to swim. In the corridor, the phone vibrates, and I look at the screen, at the number without a name, at the short message without unnecessary words. "You asked for the truth." I open the door. I stop between the glass and the noise, between my own image and someone else's hand, already reaching to turn off the light, and I realize that today the world will not stop my business. Today it will stop my past so that I can see its face. I sat in my car, locked from the inside, watching the journalists scurry through the parking lot like predators who had lost their trail but could still smell blood. My lawyers kept calling. My advisors were yelling into the phone that we needed to take a break, wait, make a statement. But I wasn't listening to anyone. I opened the letter I received in the hallway and read it over and over again. Inside were screenshots from the company's internal server, files with falsified numbers, reports I'd never seen, and most importantly, my brother's electronic signature. I looked at it, and everything I believed in began to crumble like plaster from the ceiling of an old building. How could he? A dead brother, or not so dead? My pupils constricted at the thought that someone might have used his name, but there was more to it. There was something alive in the signature, something only he knew. That night, I drove to our old house outside the city, where we had once dreamed of building an empire together. The house stood in darkness, like a monument to forgotten vows. Inside, there was dust and the smell of metal and wet stone. I walked down the hallway to the basement where it all began, where we first started the servers, before we even had an office. And there, on the concrete wall, I saw a fresh message, our old internal code. Page 47. The truth is below. I remembered the code. It meant there was a hidden section in the documents that gave access to the main servers. I tried to log in on my laptop, but the system gave me an error. Access denied by user AH. AH were my brother's initials. I leaned back against the wall, feeling the world shrink to a narrow hallway and the smell of old paint. With each passing minute, it became clearer. I had not just been framed, I had been deprived of my right to my own truth. The next morning, the government opened an investigation. Stocks fell 40%. The media screamed about the biggest scam of the decade. My partners fled like mice from a ship that was not yet sinking but already smelled of rust. I appeared before the board of directors, and they listened to me in silence, like a man who was already dead but still moving. "I didn't fake anything," I said. "Then who?" one of them asked. I didn't answer because the only name that came to mind sounded too impossible. That evening, I returned to the penthouse. The glass of the panoramic windows was black, as if the world outside had died. I was standing at the bar, pouring a whiskey, when suddenly a new message appeared on the TV screen, which I hadn't even turned on. An old video, shot on a phone. The camera was shaking, a face was visible, familiar, tired, but alive. "My brother. You once said that truth is currency," he said, looking straight into the camera. "I just exchanged yours." The screen went blank. I was left with a glass of whiskey in my hands, and I didn't know what was scarier, that he was alive or that he had destroyed me before I could find out why. I hadn't slept for 3 days. I was summoned for questioning. I signed hundreds of documents. I listened to endless versions of lawyers competing with each other to see who would lose faith in my innocence the fastest. But I remained strangely calm, like a person who had already seen the end and now wants to understand why it had come. My brother was alive, or at least someone had his memory. And somewhere among the lies, codes, ciphers, and shadows, the truth was hidden, which I had to find, because only it could return me to myself. Everything changed that night when I received an email with no subject, no sender. Inside were the coordinates and one phrase: "If you want to know why he did it, come yourself." I arrived at the outskirts of the city, at an old port warehouse. The air smelled of rust, and the lanterns shone dimly, as if they were afraid to see what was happening there. Inside stood a woman, in a dark coat, with a scar above her eyebrow, and a cold, precise gaze that pierced me to the bone. "You're late," she said. "Do you know where he is?" I replied. She smiled. "Better. I know why he did it." Her name was Leah. She had worked at our company, back in the early days, when we were just launching prototypes of analytical systems. She had disappeared suddenly, after a conflict erupted between my brother and me over control of the data. I hadn't even tried to look for her then. And now she was standing in front of me, a flash drive in her hand, as if she held the key to her own past. We sat down on old metal boxes. She inserted the flash drive into her laptop and opened a folder called Project Alethea. There were hundreds of encrypted letters, audio recordings, fragments of conversations. They all testified that my brother had exposed a global scheme while he was still alive. Our partners had manipulated financial statements not for profit, but to launder political money. And I had, unconsciously, become the screen, the brand behind which it all hid. "He tried to warn you," Leah said. "But when he realized you wouldn't believe him, he faked his own death. He made a video to make you see the system for what it was. He destroyed everything I built." I whispered. "No," she answered quietly. "He destroyed the lie you called truth." I stared at the screen, where lines of code ran, and for the first time in years I felt clarity, not fear. My brother was not the enemy. He was the judge, and perhaps his sentence was the only way to save me from myself. When we left the warehouse, dawn was already graying on the horizon. Leah gave me a flash drive. "This is only a part. The rest is his. If you want the truth, seek it. But remember, the truth does not return, it only takes away." I drove home with the feeling that my whole world was not a business, not an empire, but just a thin layer of dust above the dark water, in which someone was still alive, and this someone was waiting for me to finally look down. I was driving along the coast, where my brother and I had once competed to see who would reach the water first. Now I was racing there not for memories, but for the truth, which smelled of salt, cold, and fear. Leah said he was hiding in an old station by the lighthouse, where no one had lived for 10 years. Everything inside me screamed that this was a trap, but my heart was beating differently. Not like a businessman, not like a defendant, but like a brother who, despite everything, wants to hear a living voice instead of a ghost. When I opened the station door, I was greeted by the smell of metal, dust, and the sea. The generator hummed dully, and the monitors glittered with green lines. And he, standing in the middle of the room, my brother, grayer, thinner, but alive. with the same eyes that once shone with faith that we could change the world if we didn't lie. I knew you would come, he said, not turning. You destroyed me, I replied, my voice breaking. He turned. I saved you from the narcissistic tyrant you have become. I took a step closer. Open this. Explain. He pressed a key. The screens flashed with faces, bills, signatures, dozens of deals that had passed through my offices. You thought you controlled an empire, but you didn't see that behind your back others were using your name to launder money for those who run governments. I tried to warn you, but you no longer listened. You should have trusted me, I whispered, and you should have looked beyond your own reflection. I stood as if between two mirrors. In one, me, broken and humiliated. In the other, he, the person I could have become if I hadn't lost my conscience. We were silent. The waves crashed against the glass, as if reminding me that even the ocean eventually disappears into silence. What do you want from me? I asked. Choices, he replied. Everything here can clear your name. I've gathered evidence that you're not guilty of the fraud. But once it's made public, the empire will fall forever. Your partners, your politicians, everyone who supported you, they'll burn. And you with them. I looked at the flash drive I held in my hand. One move, and I'll save myself, but drown the world I've created. Another move, and I'll disappear forever, leaving everything behind so that the truth can live without my name. Will you do it for me? I asked. No, he said calmly. This choice must be yours. I stood before him, between the past and the future, and for the first time in my long life, I felt how easy it is to be free when there is nothing to lose. Then I inserted the flash drive into the central server and pressed upload. He looked at me silently, and I looked at the green upload scale that slowly crept up, like a sentence, like salvation. And when it reached the end, the world around us went dark, as if someone had turned off the electricity in the very sky. Now they will know, I said. Yes, he answered. But can you live with it? I didn't answer, because I already knew. The old me died with the empire, and the one who for the first time looks at the truth without fear was born. A year had passed. My name was now in the news not as a symbol of success, but as a synonym for failure. I was tried, but the case fell apart. The evidence showed that I had become nothing more than a pawn in a game that was largely controlled from the shadows. But even though I was legally free, I felt like the most imprisoned person I had ever been. Everything I had once considered solid, my company, my friends, my prestige, had melted away like a hologram that had been turned off. I lived on the coast, in a small house, where instead of calls from investors, all I heard was the sound of the waves and the creaking of old wood. My hands, once accustomed to expensive suits and the cold glass of negotiating tables, now held clay. I sculpted. I molded it into something that resembled a face. Sometimes his, sometimes mine. Sometimes they merged into one. One morning, I found an envelope on my doorstep with no return address. Inside is a short letter, a few lines written in a familiar handwriting. I went far, but I didn't run away. The truth has a price, and we both paid it. Don't look for me. Just live, finally, as a human being, not as an empire. I stared at these words for a long time, until the wind tore the sheet from my hands and carried it to the sea. I didn't rush after it, because for the first time, I didn't want to return anything. Then I realized that it had indeed won. Not me, but the lie that lived in me. Sometimes I go out to the shore at night, when the stars shine like hundreds of turned-on monitors, and I think, perhaps it is there, beyond the horizon, that he too is looking at the sky, where all our codes, all our mistakes, all our attempts to become honest, at least in the end, are stored. I have lost everything, and for the first time I am not afraid to say it. Because when there is nothing left around, there is still a chance to see yourself. And if someone ever asks what happened to my brother, I will answer, he did not disappear. He simply became the truth that I once sold, and now bought back, but at the price of everything I had. The moral is simple, albeit painful. Wealth is not about numbers. It is the freedom to be who you are, even if no one believes in you anymore. And as long as the memory of how the monitor lights go out and the truth remains lives in me, I am still breathing. And, perhaps, this time, for the first time for real.